Hi Founder fans, Jason here, and today we're going to talk about Peter Francisco, whose name you might not recognize right off the bat, but who is a legendary, almost mythical figure in at least Virginia history, if not American history. And the reason is, well, let me tell you his nickname. He was commonly known as the Virginia Giant, sometimes called the Virginian Hercules, but the Virginian Giant. Now, Peter Francisco was found on a dock in Virginia at 5 years old, speaking some weird language. Now, it turns out that language was probably Portuguese, just not a lot of people in Virginia spoke Portuguese. And how he got to the dock, we don't really know. He may have come from wealthy parents, and it may have been. It seems like it might have been a kidnapping for ransom, but then the ransom wasn't paid, and they just dumped the boy off. It's very hard to tell, but he was taken in by a cousin of Patrick Henry, actually, and he grew up. He was apprenticed to a blacksmith and learned how to be a blacksmith. He didn't get a great education. He really just learned his trade, which was common for most people who lived at the time. Now, the reason he was called the Virginia Hercules is that he was big and strong. How big? Estimates vary, but he was about somewhere around 6'6" to 6'8". Which, to put that into perspective, whenever you see an image of George Washington, he's usually the tallest one in the room. And although his height is also debated, Washington was estimated to be about 6'1". Which means this guy stands at least 5, if not 6 or 7 inches taller than George Washington. And big. And so Peter Francisco, after independence was declared, decided to join the Continental Army, and he would serve through the end of the war, from 1776 to the end of the war. And he never achieved more than the rank of private, probably because his limited education. But it was said that he was wounded several times and never left the field until the job was done. Now, after the war ended, right about the end of the war, probably after Yorktown. Now, this story is hard to justify. It definitely happened, and we know that because legends had been told about it for years and years and years. And then 40 years after the war ended, Peter went to the state of Virginia to request his veterans pay. He went to the United States government for veterans pay, which he did receive. But the first time he tells the story is when he's requesting the veterans pay. And he tells it twice, and the stories don't really line up. They're not exactly the same like you would think. Granted, this man was approaching 70 years old, and he's talking about when he was a teenager and into his early 20s. He was only about 16 when he joined the war effort. So, memories fade. We all understand that. But basically the story goes that some of Banastre Tarleton's men, Banastre Tarleton, of course, was one of the most important officers under Cornwallis in the South during the war, and who was known for his violence. About apparently 9 of Banastre Tarleton's men confronted Peter Francisco outside of a tavern. They said, "Give us your shoe buckles." And at the time, people who didn't have a lot of expensive things, shoe buckles were very important. They were one of the metal things they had. It was probably the nicest thing he owned. And they said, "Give us your shoe buckles." And he said, "Nope." And these 9 men attacked him. And he beat them off. He beat one of them, at least one of them, to death. And the others ran in fear. And he took their horses, which they left behind, as compensation for his troubles. Now that story, as I said, grew and grew and grew over the years. There was actually an engraving done of him in this situation a year or two before he began petitioning for veterans pay. So that's great. Now, not long after he tells the story, he gets his veterans pay, and that's his legend. interestingly enough, the only real official position he ever held was he got this veterans pay, but he was still really poor. He couldn't do his blacksmithing anymore. And the Virginia State Assembly took pity on him, and they hired him, even though he was 80 years old. He was still real tall and real strong. They hired him as their sergeant at arms, and which, for those of you who don't know, basically meant he was the policeman whose job was to, or sheriff, I wouldn't know what to call it, security. He was basically security for the Capitol. And that's how he spent the last few years of his life, protecting the children of the people he fought a war with, who had now risen to the tops of power in their state. He guarded them as they did the business of running the local government. So that's the short story, part myth. That's the legend of the Virginia giant, Peter Francisco. If you'd like for me to talk, there are several legends like this throughout the Revolution. If you'd like for me to talk more about them, considering starting a series where I focus on these larger-than-life figures from the American Revolution. Other ones more figuratively than this gentleman, who actually was larger than most people's lives. So if you want, leave a comment if you think I should do that. I would be happy to. Like and subscribe if you have not subscribed yet. And liking, of course, makes me happy. And I will see you tomorrow.